This is part 3 under lecture 2. In this segment, we will discuss the socio-economic impacts of British rule in India, of course keeping a special focus on Bengal, because this was Bengal from where British rule was started in India. British mainly ruled for 190 years, and during this long 190 years they had left significant impacts in the socio-economic structure of Bengal as well as India. During the first half of a century, up until 1813, British followed a policy of non-interference while ruling India, but later on they started becoming more prevalent in making and bringing changes in Indian society. And most of the changes were mainly done for the sake of their own interest. As a result, those changes detrimentally affected the Indian society. If we look at the changes and reforms done by British, it seems very clear that most of the changes were brought to serve the British. However, there were also some reforms which had significantly pushed the Indian society to the way forward very positively. In this trajectory, there are two academic discourses. One is strongly grounded by the nationalist historians and politicians, and the other one is grounded by the imperialists and the Anglicists. In this case, nationalists focus on the plunder and the oppressive policies of British, whereas the imperialists always try to justify their colonial rule as a civilizing mission. With this, the imperialists mean that the India was in darkness in the pre-British era, and British tried to bring that into the light of modernity. This may not be true, because in the pre-British era, India's economy was larger than Britain, and in case of cultural advancement, it was at least not the way behind. This discourse has been even supported by the British historian William Dalrymple in his famous book, The Anarchy, the East India Company, Corporate Violence, and the Pillage of an Empire. In this book, he detailed the plunder done by British East India Company. Therefore, the claim of civilizing mission is not unquestionable. If we take the education policy of British as an example, then we see westernization of education may have a lot of positive impacts, but the objectives are very clear, which is to serve the British government and their rule. This was truly reflected in the following statement of Thomas B. Macquarie, the law minister of the Bentinck's Council, where he said, "The aim of Western education was to form a class who may be interpreters between us and the millions who we govern, a class of persons Indian in blood and color, but English in taste, in opinions, in morals, and in intellects." Initially, the East India Company did not think that it was its duty to impart education to Indians. It allowed the old system of education to continue. Later, this system of education was eventually changed by the British. In 1813, the Charter Act of India directed the company to spend 1 lakh rupees on the education policy. But there was a debate regarding this. Orientalists advocated the traditional Indian learning through the medium of classical languages of Sanskrit and Persian. On the contrary, the Anglicists argued that the Western education should be imparted through the medium of English. Finally, English became the official language of India, replacing Persian, and in 1835 the government passed an act declaring that educational funds would be utilized for imparting Western education through the medium of English. Following this, many famous academic institutions were established, such as Hindu College or Presidency University, Fort William College, Calcutta University, Dhaka University, and many other institutions. If we take the transport and the communication policy of British as another example, then we see that a lot of modern technologies were introduced by British in India, such as railways, telegraph, and postal system, and many other. As British were mainly concerned about the trade and profit, it needed a better transportation system to ensure that British manufactured goods were to flow into India on a larger scale, and India's raw materials were to be sent for British industries very easily. British introduced steamships on the rivers and set about improving roads. A Grand Trunk Road from Calcutta to Delhi was completed in the 1850s, but the most significant inclusion in the transport system was the introduction of the railways. The first railway line was constructed in Bombay in 1853 during the rule of Lord Dalhousie, who thought the railways would enable the government to administer the country more effectively, and it would also enable the government to mobilize military troops easily during the crisis. But this plan was not much organized, responding to the needs of Indians. Consequently, it affected waterways and irrigation system. The chart on this slide shows us the detrimental effects of disorganized and unplanned rail lines in India. As it portrays, in the first 53 years in the 19th century, 13 famines occurred with a death toll of 5 million people. On the other hand, after the introduction of disorganized rail lines, 16 famines occurred within a short period of 20 years only, which killed 12 million people. The first railway line in Bombay was opened to traffic in 1853. This was one of the revolutionary change in Indian transportation system. If we look at the nature of colonial revenue policy, it becomes very clear that the main objectives was to maximize profit for the colonizers, instead of ensuring welfare for the subjects. The statement of Robert Clive in the slide truly reflects that, where he admits the massive profit which was drained by British East India Company to England in the year 1765 to 1766. The profit of the company in 1 year was as worthy as 12 crore and 50 lakh rupees. The reference from William Dalrymple shows that the estimated revenue of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa was 2 to 3 million pound, which stands 210 to 315 million pound based on the present value. After paying a very nominal amount of money to the Mughal Emperor and the Nawab of Bengal. British East India Company used to take rest of the money. With this, a bankrupt company soon became a corporate giant in the world. William Dalrymple detailed this plunder in his famous book, The Anarchy. As British East India Company was a trading company, their revenue policy under the dual system was not peasant-friendly at all. The slide shows that the company increased the amount of tax even during the years of Great Bengal Famine in 1770, where 10 million people of Bengal were perished due to the starvation. But still, colonial power or colonizers remain totally indifferent. As of now, we have already discussed the impact of permanent settlement under part 2 of this lecture. We detailed the education policy, revenue policy, and transport policy. The social changes and reforms would be detailed in the next class. Just to go with the flow, here I would like to mention some of the very important social reforms done by British government. It changed the orthodox social norms and practices like sati, female infanticide, dowry system, widow marriage, and many other. Along with that, institutional development and modernization of administration took place during the British era. Some of our previous slides and discussion show us how the British policy had increased the sufferings of the peasants. As a result of that, the Golden Bengal turned into a country of ever famines. The root cause of the most of those famines were the economic exploitation and the resource drain from India. It has been truly reflected in a quotation of Arcedat, which he mentioned in his famous book, Economic History of India, in reference to a native poet. The moisture sucked up by the sun to be returned to the earth as fertilizing rain, but the moisture raised from the Indian soil now descends as fertilizing rain largely on the land of others, not on India. The oppressive policy of British colonial rule gave the birth of a lot of anti-British movements, such as Indigo resistance, Farisi movement, Santal resistance, Swadeshi movement, Khilafat movement, Tevaga movement, and a lot more. Due to the oppressive colonial rule and the increasing awareness against that, helped India grow up with a sense of self-rule, which ultimately turned into the growth of Indian nationalism. But to control this growing sense of nationalism, British applied the divide and rule policy, which increased the distance between Hindus and Muslims. From the beginning of 20th century, Hindus and Muslims and their identity politics became very prevalent. So this is when identity politics based on the religious identity started in India. This communal politics instigated many riots between Hindus and Muslims and finally gave the birth of independent India and Pakistan in 1947. These are the suggested readings for this lecture. That's all for class 2. I hope you enjoyed our discussion under class 2. In our next class, we will focus on the reforms, repercussions, and resistances under British rule in India. Thanks for watching this class.